The bench at the corner of Main and 3rd was empty when Laura Bennett arrived at 4:53 in the afternoon, still wearing scrubs damp with other people's blood and sweat. She'd worked a double shift, 16 hours, and her feet ached in a way that suggested her shoes had developed their own gravity. The Houston heat shimmered off the pavement in waves that looked almost liquid, and the smell of diesel exhaust mixed with something sweet and rotting from the dumpster behind the Thai restaurant. She stood waiting for the number 7 bus, scrolling through messages from her son Marcus without really reading them, her body doing that thing tired bodies do, present but not quite awake. She didn't see the man approach the bench beside the shelter. He was older, maybe late 60s, wearing faded Wranglers and a button-up shirt that had been washed so many times the color had surrendered to gray. What Laura did notice was the bench settling under his weight differently than it should, and the sound that came with it, a sharp intake of breath, the kind that meant pain was information his body was trying to deliver. She glanced sideways. Just a passenger waiting for a bus. Nothing unusual. Nothing that required her attention off the clock. The man's breathing changed rhythm. Laura had spent 12 years listening to humans breathe, in operating rooms, in ICU bays, in supply closets at 3 in the morning, and she knew the sound of lungs trying to do their job with half the space they needed. His shoulders were rising and falling in that jerky, insufficient way that came from accessory muscle recruitment. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, and his jawline had that rigid tension of someone clenching through pain. She went back to her phone. Not her shift. Not her responsibility. 30 seconds later, his lips were blue. The color appeared like someone had switched a filter on, cyanotic creeping across his mouth as his hands gripped the edge of the bench hard enough to make the metal creak. His eyes were still open but unfocused, and his breathing had stopped being a rhythm and started being a gasp. Laura watched for 3 more seconds, long enough to rule out panic, long enough to confirm what her 12 years were screaming at her, and then her body moved without asking permission from her brain. She was beside him in 2 steps. "Where does it hurt?" His mouth opened. Nothing came out except a wheeze that sounded like wind through a damaged pipe. Right side. The way he was leaning, the way his left arm was tucked against his ribs, the way his chest on the right was moving less than the left. Laura's hands were already moving, fingers pressing into the space between his ribs, assessing the way the air moved beneath the skin. The absence of air movement on the right side. The way his trachea had drifted slightly left, subtle enough that a paramedic might miss it on first assessment. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung with pressure building inside the chest cavity, pushing everything sideways, crushing the heart. Without intervention in the next 90 seconds, his heart would stop entirely. The pressure would become absolute. She pulled a ballpoint pen from her scrub pocket, Bic, blue ink, hospital pharmacy logo, and cracked it apart with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing this exact thing with dummies in training scenarios. She'd never done it on a living human. She'd never had to. Until now. "This is going to hurt," she said, and there was something in her voice, something that didn't sound like a tired nurse at a bus stop, something that sounded like someone giving a command. The needle she created from the pen casing was crude but functional. She located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and pushed through skin and muscle and pleural membrane with the kind of steadiness that came from knowing exactly what would happen next. The hiss. That beautiful, terrible hiss of pressurized air escaping. The sound of physics correcting itself. His body convulsed once, sharply, and then something in his spine straightened. His shoulders dropped. His breathing, still labored, at least became breathing again, oxygen moving, lungs expanding, the right side of his chest rising to match the left. "Okay," she said quietly, keeping the improvised needle steady. "Okay. You're going to be okay." Her other hand was already dialing with her car keys. She'd used them to deflate the pressure fully, a second point of decompression if the pen casing wasn't enough, and the 911 operator answered on the second ring. Laura gave information in the kind of clipped, precise language that made it clear she wasn't a civilian reporting an emergency, she was someone who understood anatomy and consequence. Tension pneumothorax, possible trauma to the right lung. Needle decompression performed. Patient is breathing. I need an ambulance at Main and 3rd, City Bus Stop, ETA immediately. The operator tried to ask questions. Laura ignored her. She kept her hand on the makeshift needle, kept her voice steady, kept her eyes on the man's face while his color returned from blue to gray to something approaching pink again. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes. They saw a woman in scrubs kneeling beside a man in the middle of Houston summer heat, one hand on his chest holding a pen casing in place, her other hand resting on his shoulder, and her face the kind of calm that only comes from having already done the hardest part. "Medic," the lead paramedic said. It wasn't a question. "Nurse," Laura corrected. She stepped back the moment they were in position, letting them take over, but even as they stabilized him and moved him to the stretcher, the man's eyes stayed fixed on her face. "What's your name?" he asked, words coming in gasps between oxygen delivery. She didn't answer. She watched them load him into the ambulance, watched the doors close, watched the vehicle pull away from the curb with lights painting the street red and white. Then she sat back down on the bench and waited for the bus that would take her home. The number 7 came 7 minutes later. She boarded automatically, paid with her card, and took a window seat in the back where no one could sit beside her. Houston rolled past strip malls and used car lots and churches with digital signs advertising salvation like it was on sale. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus again, heading over tomorrow around 2. Mom, is everything okay? You're being weird." She responded with a heart emoji again. That was easier than words. The bus turned onto Mercy General Service Road at 5:48. She got off at the employee entrance, swiped her badge, Bell Bennett, RN, and made her way through the corridors she'd walked for 6 years. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic hymn. The smell of antiseptic and machinery and the vague organic scent of a hospital, that mix of cleaning solutions and human biology that never fully washed away, surrounded her like a familiar coat. She changed into the fresh scrubs in her locker, the one she kept there for night shift, and clipped her badge back on. 5:52. The night shift started at 6. She had 8 minutes to sit in the break room and pretend she wasn't still feeling the resistance of skin and muscle when the pen casing had pushed through. The ER was quiet when she started her shift. Triage had 2 patients, a woman with a migraine, an older man with chest pain who would probably get admitted. Laura moved through her assignments with the kind of mechanical precision that came from doing the same job in the same place for the same hours every night. Vitals. Charts. For insertions. The slow, steady work of keeping broken people stable until someone with more authority could decide what to do with them. She didn't think about the man at the bus stop. She didn't think about what would have happened if she'd stayed focused on her phone, if she'd looked away one more second, if her hands had hesitated. She was good at not thinking about things. It was a skill she'd developed across 12 years and 3 deployments and 2 Purple Hearts and a rank she never mentioned to anyone at the hospital. Her phone buzzed at 10 past midnight. A text from an unknown number: "You saved my life. Memorial General, ICU. M. Chen." She deleted it without responding. At 2 in the morning, a nurse she recognized from triage came to find her in the medication room. "That Army Ranger they brought in from the bus stop? He's asking for the nurse who treated him. Says she saved him at the stop before the ambulance came. He's insisting he wants to thank her personally." Laura arranged the medication bottles on the shelf with more attention than they required. "Tell him I'm glad he's doing better. He doesn't believe you weren't here. He says," the nurse paused, looking uncomfortable. "He says nobody could do what you did without training. He says you're military." The silence in the medication room was the kind of silence that happened before bad things, the kind Laura had learned to recognize in places with more to fire and decisions that couldn't be unmade. She closed the cabinet gently and turned to face the nurse. "Tell him I'm just a nurse," Laura said. "Night shift at a city hospital." She went back to her patients before the nurse could ask follow-up questions. The night stretched longer after that. Laura moved through her assignments the way she always did, efficient, careful, invisible. She'd chosen night shifts at Mercy General specifically because of the invisibility, because the hospital was quieter after dark, because fewer people asked questions about employment gaps or why someone with her competence was working 12-hour shifts in a half-full emergency room instead of moving up to administration or teaching. She'd left a lot of things behind 6 years ago. The rank on her uniform. The unit patch on her chest. The boots, those particular boots with the sand from Ramadi still embedded in the creases where the sole met the upper, and she'd been meaning to clean out since she got home but never quite did. Instead, she'd locked them in a glass case at the bottom of her bedroom closet, and she polished them every Sunday out of habit, muscle memory overriding everything else. At 5:30 in the morning, Marcus texted again, "See you in less than 9 hours. Please tell me you slept." She hadn't slept in roughly 48 hours. She responded anyway, "I'm good. See you at 2. The morning shift came in at 6 and relieved her. Laura changed out of her scrubs in the employee locker room, hung them on the hook where they always went, and walked to her car in the pre-dawn darkness. The Houston air was already warming, already preparing to become insufferable. She sat in the driver's seat for 17 minutes without turning the key, hands at 10 and 2, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. The Army Ranger was awake in the ICU upstairs. The one she'd saved at the bus stop, the one whose name was Chen and who'd looked at her like he recognized something in the way she moved, in the way her hands had been steady when everything around her was falling apart. She'd seen that look before, a long time ago, in places that no longer existed on maps. It was the look someone gave when they realized they were standing next to someone who understood what they understood, someone who'd seen the same things. She started the car and drove home to her apartment in a complex that looked like every other apartment complex in Houston, in neutral colors, nobody asking questions, the kind of place where people came to disappear. Marcus arrived at 2:05, carrying takeout Thai food and wearing the expression he always wore when he visited, concern barely hidden behind cheerfulness. He was 28, worked in corporate finance, had never asked her directly about the missing years but had figured out enough to know they existed. "You look terrible," he said, setting the food on the kitchen counter. "Did you work yesterday?" "Double shift." Laura got plates and forks. "You look good. Something new at work?" He launched into a story about a project and a promotion and a woman from accounting, the kind of normal life story that belonged to people who hadn't spent their 20s in places with names like Ramadi and Jolin District. Laura listened and smiled and asked questions in the right places, and after they ate, Marcus wandered into her bedroom the way he always did, looking for the thing he could never quite ask about directly. Her bedroom was organized. Sparse. No photos on the walls. No memorabilia. Nothing that explained where she'd been before Houston. Just a bed, a dresser, a closet, and in the back of that closet, in a glass display case with a lock on it, a pair of combat boots. "Why do you keep them locked up?" Marcus asked, not for the first time. "If you're not going to throw them away, why not just have them out?" Laura was making the bed, pulling the comforter straight. "They're heavy," she said. "Better to keep them stored." "Mom. Come on." He was looking at the case, at the way the boots were positioned, at the way they were polished so carefully that the leather almost glowed. "Whose boots were they? Why won't you talk about where you were all those years?" The afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made the boots look like they were glowing from inside themselves. Laura stood beside her son and looked at them the way she might look at someone she used to know. "Someday," she said quietly. "Not yet." "When someday?" Marcus asked. But there was no answer that made sense, so Laura didn't try to make one. She just closed the closet door and finished making her bed, and Marcus didn't push any further because he'd learned by now that there were questions his mother would never answer, and that sometimes love meant accepting the silence. That night, back at Mercy General for another shift, Laura learned that the Army Ranger, Master Sergeant David Chen, had been moved out of ICU. He was stable. He was asking about her again. And somewhere in the building, a new chief of medicine was starting his first week, and people were already talking about how strict he was, how he didn't tolerate rule-breaking, how he'd made 3 nurses nervous in his first 2 days. Dr. Sterling, people said his name was. Laura checked her schedule and prepared herself for whatever came next. She'd survived worse than a difficult administrator. But as she walked through the hospital corridors, past the ICU where Chen was recovering, past the offices where Sterling was probably already making plans, she didn't know that the quiet 6 years were ending. She didn't know that everything was about to change. But something in her, the part that had trained for 18 years, that had sat in aircraft watching city lights disappear beneath clouds, that had made decisions that couldn't be unmade, something in that part of her was already preparing for the next crisis. The hallway outside the staff lounge smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic. Laura was reaching for her locker when Dr. Raymond Sterling's voice cut through the corridor like a blade. "So you're the Girl Scout who thinks playing hero at bus stops makes good PR." She turned. Sterling stood 3 feet away, his white coat pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his tie a shade of blue that cost more than her monthly rent. His cologne arrived before his words did, something expensive and suffocating. "You performed an unauthorized medical procedure," he continued, his voice carrying down the hallway so that nurses 2 doors down could hear every syllable. "Made this hospital liable. And frankly, sweetheart, I give you a week before you're gone." Laura took one measured breath. Met his eyes. Held them. "The man is alive, Doctor." Sterling's smile didn't reach his face. It was the smile of a wolf recognizing prey that didn't know it was already caught. "For now. We'll see how alive your career is." He walked past her, and she caught the scent of his cologne mixing with something else, the smell of institutional power. 3 board members on speed dial. 23 years of connections. The kind of man who could make a phone call and watch someone's entire life restructure around his whim. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended her before it even began. The whisper campaign started that afternoon. By evening, it had metastasized through every department. Laura heard it in fragments, in the break room, in the medication dispensary, in the hallway outside radiology. She was reckless. Unstable. Trying too hard to be a hero. One nurse, Jennifer, someone Laura had trained, actually said the words out loud, "She's going to get someone killed eventually. You can just tell." The rest of them nodded like she'd announced the weather. Laura worked her shifts with her head down, her hands moving through routine tasks with the kind of mechanical precision that came from somewhere older than conscious thought. Vitals. Charting. For placements. Her hands remembered things her mouth couldn't say. For days after Sterling's hallway ambush, Laura carried her lunch tray toward an empty table in the cafeteria. The fluorescent lights above hummed their constant electric drone. The room was loud with the sound of 200 people eating and talking and not paying attention. Sterling sat at the doctor's table. He was watching her. She didn't register his movement until the tray was already falling. His shoulder had accidentally collided with hers, a perfect execution of plausible deniability. Soup exploded across the white tile floor. The bowl shattered. Bread scattered. Applesauce decorated her shoes. The room went dead silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. 200 people turned in perfect synchronization. The only sound was soup dripping from the edge of the table onto the floor. Drip. 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 Sterling looked down at her with his wolf's smile. "Clumsy, sweetheart. Better clean that up before someone gets hurt." Laura stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The part of her that had trained for 18 years, the part that had rappelled out of helicopters at 2 in the morning, that had made decisions that couldn't be unmade, that had watched men die and kept going anyway, that part was already calculating angles and exits and whether his jaw would break if she drove her palm upward from below. She took one measured breath. A single tear escaped her left eye. Only one. She didn't let it fall. She caught it with the back of her hand, wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice was steady as stone. "I've been on my knees in worse places than this, Doctor, and I got back up every time." The room exhaled. She bent to collect the tray pieces. Soup soaked through her scrubs. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that made the task look like a ritual. She gathered each piece methodically. The broken ceramic. The scattered bread. The applesauce spread like something that needed containing. Sterling watched her work. Then he picked up her patient charts from the adjacent table and dropped them at her feet. The paper scattered across the floor, mixing with the soup debris, curling slightly as the liquid soaked through them. "Pick those up, sweetheart." She picked them up too. That night, Laura sat on her kitchen floor in the dark. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat with her back against the refrigerator and let her hands shake where no one could see them. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the sound her body made when her mind was holding something back that wanted desperately to move, to act, to respond in ways that would have made everything worse. She thought about Sterling's smile. She thought about the 200 people watching. She thought about the fact that he would do it again tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. He would escalate because that's what men like Sterling did. They kept pushing until something broke. The next morning, Laura found her locker defaced. A sticky note in red marker, day 6. Tick-tock. She peeled it off with hands that had stopped shaking by then. The hands of someone who had learned to compartmentalize. To separate her body from her mind. To let one part survive while another part waited in cold storage for the moment when she could finally use the training no one at Mercy General even knew she'd received. That Saturday, her son Marcus sat at her kitchen table in army fatigues, drinking coffee she'd made too strong out of habit rather than skill. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders. His uniform bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. He was talking about his new unit assignment. "I got reassigned, Mom. My CO just got back from Ramadi, actually, funny story. He almost died at a bus stop last week. Some nurse saved his life with a pen and car keys." Laura's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "Your commanding officer?" she asked carefully. "Master Sergeant David Chen. Tension pneumothorax. They brought him straight to Mercy General." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Crazy thing is, they still don't know who the nurse was. She never even told anyone her name. Just saved his life and disappeared." The kitchen tilted slightly. Laura set her cup down with absolute precision, centering it on the saucer with the kind of care usually reserved for diffusing ordnance. "He's at my hospital." The question came out neutral. Detached. Professional. "Yeah. I'm visiting him tomorrow. You should come, he'd want to thank whoever saved him. It's someone from your ER, I think." Laura excused herself to the bathroom, gripped the sink, stared at her reflection in the mirror. The same face that had looked back from truck mirrors in Ramadi looked back now. 18 years older. 18 years changed. But underneath, in the structure of the bones, in the set of the eyes, in the way the jaw held tension, underneath, the same woman. The one who had been someone other than just a nurse. She splashed cold water on her face. Returned to the kitchen with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I have a shift tomorrow, honey. You go see him." After Marcus left, Laura sat alone at the table. She pulled out her phone, opened the hospital staff directory, searched for patient admissions. Found the name. Stared at the room number until the screen went dark. Her reflection stared back from the black glass. Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, its rotors beating the air like a distant pulse. Her hands started shaking again, and this time she didn't try to stop them. She let them shake because that's what happened when the past you tried to outrun finally caught you at exactly the moment when you were least prepared to face it. The next morning, she called in sick. It was the first shift she'd missed in 8 months. She sat on her couch in the dark and waited for whatever was about to happen next. Saturday morning arrived with the weight of all the things Laura hadn't said. Marcus sat on her couch, still in his Class A uniform, the dress blues sharp enough to cut, and he was telling her about his commanding officer's recovery when her hands stopped moving. They had been folding a kitchen towel. Now they simply held it, suspended between her chest and the armrest. "My CO is at Mercy General," Marcus said, reaching for coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "Master Sergeant David Chen. Been with Charlie Platoon since the Ramadi rotation. He collapsed at a bus stop Monday morning, and the ER doctors said some nurse performed an emergency needle decompression right there on the street. Saved his life with a ballpoint pen and sheer luck. When he woke up in ICU, he asked about her. Nobody knew her name. The whole unit's been trying to track her down." Laura set the towel down on the couch arm. The fabric made no sound. The apartment was too quiet. Outside, traffic moved through Houston in that Saturday afternoon pattern, leisurely, unhurried. Everything felt like it was moving through water. "Marcus," she said. Her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "What did he look like?" "Your commanding officer." Her son turned to face her fully then, and she saw the exact moment recognition began to bloom behind his eyes. Not full understanding yet. Just the first crack of awareness that this question meant something. That his mother didn't ask idle questions about strangers. Tall. Serious guy. Scar across his left cheekbone, knife fight in Sanjin Valley, year before I transferred in. "Why would you?" He stopped. The coffee cup lowered. "Mom." It wasn't a question. She had saved an Army Ranger at that bus stop. She had performed a needle decompression with a ballpoint pen and her car keys while his lips turned blue, while his oxygen saturation crashed toward numbers that meant brain death, that meant nothing. And that Army Ranger was Marcus's commanding officer. Which meant that everything she had built in the 7 years since she'd left the SEAL teams, the anonymity, the quiet night shifts, the locked cabinet where she kept the trauma shears with the call sign she no longer spoke aloud, was about to collapse like a building in uncontrolled demolition. "How long have you known?" Marcus asked quietly. "Since Monday night when you mentioned his name in the hospital hallway and I went home and couldn't stop my hands from shaking for 4 hours. Monday morning had arrived differently. Laura had walked into Mercy General at 5:50 a.m., ready for the day shift she'd picked up to cover for Rodriguez, when Dr. Sterling had intercepted her at the nurse's station with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd made a small gesture, just a curl of his index finger, and she'd followed him to his office like a dog on an invisible leash, because that was what protocol demanded and because she had learned a long time ago that it was easier to obey than to question. His office smelled like expensive cologne and old leather. The kind of space where power lived in the furniture, in the way the desk faced the door at exactly the right angle to make anyone who sat across from it feel smaller. He had settled into his chair with the kind of satisfaction that came from having already won the fight before it started. "I've been making calls, sweetheart," he'd said, and there was that nickname again, wrapped around her like barbed wire. "Interesting employment history you have. Or rather, don't have." Laura had kept her hands flat on her thighs. She had not corrected him. She had not moved. 7-year gap with no references. No records. No explanation. He leaned back, fingers steepled like he was praying to a god made entirely of institutional authority. "I've contacted your nursing school. They remember you, a sharp candidate," they said, "but they seemed confused about where you've been. I brought in an HR investigator. Outside firm. Very thorough. And I made some calls to 3 board members who owe me favors. People at their level don't forget promises." The fluorescent panels overhead cast a light that made everything look slightly diseased. Laura had felt that light on the back of her neck like a physical thing. "I've done nothing wrong," she had said. Her voice was steady. This was the truth, and the truth had a frequency all its own. "Then you have nothing to worry about." His smile had been a knife blade turned sideways. "Now get back to work. While you still have work." The investigator had arrived by mid-afternoon. Gray suit, gray eyes, the kind of efficient movement that came from asking questions for a living. Her name was Patricia Voss and she moved through Mercy General like she owned it, requesting personnel files, conducting quiet interviews in the break room, her voice low and professional while Laura watched through the observation window. She'd spoken to Rodriguez for 15 minutes. To Chen in radiology for 20. To the 2 charge nurses who'd supervised Laura's shifts. Each conversation was a small knife cut. By 2 p.m., Patricia Voss and Dr. Sterling had shaken hands in the parking lot, their silhouettes framed against the autumn sun in a way that looked like a completed transaction. At 3:30, HR called her in. The director, a woman named Michelle who had always seemed genuinely kind, had delivered the news with the kind of apologetic firmness that meant the decision was already made. Administrative leave. Pending investigation. Protocol. Liability concerns. Credential verification. The words came in a sequence that meant Laura's access badge would be deactivated before she left the building. Security had walked her to her locker. The same guard who had smiled at her last week, who had asked about Marcus's deployment, now looked at a point somewhere above her left shoulder as if he'd never seen her face before. Laura had moved mechanically, pulling out her spare scrubs, 2 pair, stacked neatly, the framed photo of Marcus in his dress uniform, the small first aid kit she kept in the back corner for the evening shifts when the supply closets were locked. Everything fit into a cardboard box that smelled like old deliveries and crushed hopes. Dr. Sterling had watched from his office window. She'd felt his gaze like a scope on her back. Arms crossed. Backlit by the dying sun so that his face was a silhouette, just the outline of a man, which somehow made him worse, made him into a shape rather than a person. Laura had carried the box through the main corridor where night shift was arriving. She'd felt their eyes. Felt the questions forming behind their professional facades. Just a sudden termination. Just a nurse who'd violated something. Just someone being escorted out. She'd sat in her car in the parking lot for exactly 20 minutes. Her hands had gripped the steering wheel but her foot couldn't find the brake pedal, couldn't seem to remember what came next. The sky had turned from gold to purple to the dark blue that came just before black. Somewhere in the hospital behind her, Dr. Sterling had probably been reviewing his schedule, moving on to his next appointment, his next conquest, never aware that he'd just kicked over the first domino in a sequence that would end with him selling insurance policies from a folding table under a faded umbrella. But she hadn't known that yet. On Monday evening, sitting in her Subaru in the Mercy General parking lot, all Laura had known was that everything was moving very fast and she couldn't seem to get ahead of it. Now it was Saturday, and Marcus was staring at her with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand why his mother kept a pair of combat boots locked in a bedroom closet. Why she never spoke about the 7 years between nursing school and her first shift at Mercy General. Why her hands moved sometimes with a precision that seemed surgical, and sometimes with a speed that seemed military. "You were at that bus stop," Marcus said. "Not a question." "I was waiting for the express line," Laura replied. He collapsed. "I did what I could." "You performed emergency needle decompression at a bus stop with a ballpoint pen, Mom. That's not something a regular ER nurse knows how to do by accident. That's not something a regular nurse does with that kind of calm." Laura stood. She walked to the window and looked out at Houston, the city sprawling beneath the afternoon light, millions of people moving through their own stories, most of them completely unaware that somewhere in a hospital, an investigation was happening. That somewhere in an office, a man in a leather chair was making phone calls to people who owed him favors. That somewhere in her own apartment, her son was beginning to connect dots that should have stayed forever disconnected. "I need to take a walk," she said. "I'll be back before dinner." She didn't wait for him to respond. She moved toward the door with the kind of precision that left no room for questions, and Marcus, who had learned in the army that sometimes orders come without being spoken aloud, simply nodded and let her go. Outside, the Houston heat was already beginning to fade into evening. Laura walked without direction, letting her feet carry her through neighborhoods she didn't recognize, past houses where families were gathering for dinner, past a school where children played in the last light of the day. The combat boots were in her bedroom closet back home, locked in a metal case under old uniforms she'd promised herself she'd never wear again. Except the case wasn't locked anymore, had never really been locked, because locks were useless against the kind of truth that needed to come out. Master Sergeant David Chen was awake somewhere in Mercy General Hospital. Dr. Sterling was making phone calls. An investigator was compiling files. And Laura Bennett, Senior Chief Petty Officer, 3 tours in Ramadi, the woman who had survived 7 years of trying to disappear, was running out of time to decide who she wanted to be when the rest of the world finally figured out who she'd always been. The cardboard box sat on the security desk like a confession. Everything Laura owned at Mercy General fit inside it: a stethoscope coiled like a snake, 3 pairs of compression socks still in the package, a half-empty container of antacids, the trauma shears with her initials scratched into the handle. The guard wouldn't meet her eyes as he handed it over. Protocol. Nothing personal. Your badge, he said quietly. She unclipped it from her scrubs. The laminated photo was 3 years old, her hair shorter then, her face still carrying the weight of someone trying to disappear into white walls and fluorescent lights. She set it on the desk next to the box. The guard's jaw tightened. He'd seen her work the night shift for 18 months. She'd held his daughter's hand once in the ER after a car accident, whispered something that made the girl stop screaming. He wanted to say something now. His mouth opened. Then he glanced up toward the administrative wing where Sterling's office overlooked the main entrance, and the guard just nodded. 72 hours. That's how long it took to dismantle a life. The investigator had been thorough. Her employment gap between 2015 and 2022 was a void he'd itemized like a crime scene. No tax returns for 7 years. No documented address. No explanation. Sterling had weaponized it with surgical precision, called the Texas Board of Nursing at 8 a.m., referenced the gap, suggested institutional liability. By noon, the board had frozen her credentials pending review. By 3 p.m., security was walking her to the elevator. She could see Sterling through the glass partition of his office on the 3rd floor, arms crossed, watching her departure like a general surveying conquered territory. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather. His expression was the cold satisfaction of a man who'd just eliminated a problem using nothing but other people's fear and 3 phone calls. He'd won. The scoreboard didn't lie: 1 decorated officer's career in ruins, 1 hospital's liability reduced to 0, 1 woman who'd saved an Army Ranger's life escorted out like she'd stolen the medicine cabinet. Laura drove home in silence. No radio. No podcasts. Just the sound of the air conditioning struggling against the Houston heat and her own breathing, which felt like it belonged to someone else. The cardboard box sat on the passenger seat, and every pothole sent something shifting inside it. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She was supposed to be at work in 4 hours. Night shift. The ICU was already short-staffed. They'd call her. She knew how the system worked. They'd call at 5 p.m. asking if she could come in early. At 5:15 p.m., they'd call again. By 6 p.m., they'd know. By 7 p.m., they'd have her replacement scheduled. By tomorrow, there would be a new name on the roster, and Mercy General would move forward without her like water flowing around a stone. The front door was locked. That was wrong. Marcus wasn't supposed to be home until 1800 hours. He'd texted her this morning from Fort Sam Houston before PT. His duffel bag sat in the hallway, combat gear still dusty from the range. His keys hung by the door. She found him in the kitchen, making a sandwich with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who'd been up for 16 hours straight. He looked up. His eyes were dark, sharp, the same color as hers but with something in them she'd spent 6 years trying to keep him from ever developing, the weight of things that shouldn't be asked of young men. He was already reaching for full staff sergeant rank, everyone said so. Natural leader. Decorated soldier. He'd never asked her directly, but she could feel the weight of his questions like atmospheric pressure building before a storm. Mom. His voice was careful. The voice he used with casualties. Why are you home? She set the box on the kitchen table between them. The sound it made when it landed was final, like a judge's gavel. Marcus set down his sandwich. What is that? She couldn't speak. The words were there somewhere, shaped like explanations, like apologies, like reasons that made sense in her head but dissolved on her tongue like bitter medicine. Her hands began to shake, and she crossed her arms to hide them. Too late. Her son had been trained to read vital signs in human behavior the same way she had. He saw the tremor. He saw the tears she was fighting. He saw a mother breaking in front of him for the first time in his living memory. "Mom, what happened?" He moved to open the box. "Don't." Her voice came out as a whisper. "Don't open it." But he already had. He saw the badge on top, saw his mother's laminated photograph, understood in the way soldiers understand, the immediate, wordless recognition of catastrophe. "They fired you." It wasn't a question. Laura pulled out a chair and sat heavily, her body suddenly too heavy to hold up. She pressed her face into her hands. 6 years of silence. 6 years of waking at 2 a.m. from dreams where she was still in Ramadi, where the screaming was real, where the smell of diesel and burning concrete was not a memory but a present tense. 6 years of choosing a hospital job with mild insomnia over a classified career with classified nightmares. 6 years of letting her son believe she was just a nurse. Marcus sat across from her, his duffel bag still in the hallway like a suitcase full of questions. "Why?" "Mom, you're the best nurse at that hospital. Every person on my command knows about you." "No." Her head came up. Her voice was sharp as broken glass. "No. Marcus, you don't understand." "Then explain it." His own voice was rising, the frustration of a son trying to understand his mother boiling over. "Just tell me why. Tell me where you were during the gap. Tell me why you have those boots locked in your room. Tell me why you won't defend yourself. Tell me why you're letting some asshole doctor destroy your career without a fight. I don't understand. I don't understand why you're just accepting this." Laura's shoulders curved inward, her body folding in on itself like a closing fist. "Because some wounds need silence to heal. Because I chose anonymity to survive. Because if I explain, if I open that door, it all comes back." Her voice cracked. "The PTSD nearly destroyed me. Do you understand? The things I did over there, the things I saw, the weight of 7 years trying to keep that in a locked box, if I start talking about it, if I start defending myself, the box opens. And I don't know if I can survive what comes out." Marcus stared at her for a long moment. His jaw clenched. His hands formed fists on the kitchen table. Then he unclenched them, reached across the table, and covered her hands with his own. "Sergeant Chen keeps asking about you. He knows it was you at the bus stop. He wants to thank you." "I can't," Laura whispered. "Why not?" "Mom, you saved his life. I can't go back there." The words hung in the kitchen air like humidity after rain. Marcus wanted to argue. She could see it building in him, the soldier's logic, the need to solve the problem, to protect his mother the way she'd protected him his entire life. But he was also her son, and he understood that some things couldn't be argued away. He just sat there, his hand on top of hers, while she cried in a way that scared them both, not loud, not theatrical, but deep and silent, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere beneath survival. That night, Laura didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through every moment, the needle slide into the ranger's chest at the bus stop, his grateful eyes as oxygen began returning to his bloodstream, the way she'd felt alive for the first time in 6 years. Then Sterling's face watching her walk out of Mercy General. Then Marcus's confusion. Then the locked case in her bedroom closet containing boots that had walked through fire. Tuesday morning, Marcus left without her. She heard his truck start at 0600 hours, heard the gravel crunch under his tires as he headed back to Fort Sam Houston. He didn't ask her again. That was worse. At 11 a.m., her phone rang. The number was Mercy General. The voice on the other end was Nurse Chen, no relation to the ranger, just coincidence, her voice tight with panic. Laura, listen, I know you're not working, but we have a situation in the ICU. Patient came in this morning, admitted through the ER, and he's combative, screaming in Arabic, really unstable. Psychiatry is on their way, but he's demanding to see, he's asking for someone. He saw you yesterday when you were cleaning out your locker. He keeps pointing at the glass partition and saying something that sounds like senior chief. Nobody knows what he wants. Can you? Laura hung up. Her hand was shaking as she set the phone on the counter. She stared at it. It rang again. Same number. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Different extension. She didn't answer. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd cried in front of her son, and stared at the cardboard box still sitting there, everything she'd built in 18 months reduced to emergency supplies and memories. At 11:22 a.m., she picked up her keys. The drive to Mercy General took 12 minutes. She sat in her car in the parking lot for another 8, hands on the steering wheel, telling herself all the reasons not to go inside. The doors would smell like antiseptic and fear. The hallways would echo with memories of nights she'd tried to outrun. The ICU was where the sickest people went, where decisions had to be made in seconds, where failure meant flatline and code blues and families crying in waiting rooms. But somewhere on the 3rd floor, a man was screaming her name. At 12:03 p.m., she walked through the sliding glass doors of Mercy General Hospital for what she thought might be the last time of her life. The air hit her like a physical thing, recycled, sterile, alive with the ambient electricity of critical care. Her badge was gone, but the security guard at the desk recognized her. His eyes widened. He opened his mouth to say something, then recognized the expression on her face and let her pass. The ICU was controlled chaos. 2 security guards stood outside a room on the northeast corner, their posture tense. Through the glass partition, Laura could see a patient with a severely scarred face, burned scars that told a story of fire and survival, flailing against restraints, his voice hoarse from screaming. Arabic phrases mixed with English desperation. Then he saw her through the glass. The screaming changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was recognition. It was gratitude. It was the voice of a man who'd thought he would die in a burning building in Ramadi and had lived because someone had pulled him out. Senior Chief. Senior Chief. Marcus stood beside the bed, his army uniform still crisp from this morning, his face a study in complete confusion. Dr. Sterling was there too, pushed to the side of the room, irritated at the disruption, his silk tie gleaming under the fluorescent lights like something clean in a room full of suffering. Laura's hands began to move without permission from her brain. She took the patient file from the nearest nurse station. Her eye scanned the intake notes. The paper felt thin as cigarette smoke. Former insurgent from Ramadi seeking asylum. Pulmonary contusion from smoke inhalation and blunt force trauma. Scars consistent with severe thermal injuries. Patient requesting protected witness status based on testimony regarding female American operative, DevGru team, 2015 to 2017, who extracted him from active combat zone during operation. The file slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. Then came the sound that changed everything. Not a monitor beeping or a ventilator wheeze. Boots on tile. Military boots. The distinctive rhythm of someone trained to move with purpose through a world where purpose meant life or death. Master Sergeant David Chen appeared in the ICU doorway, still wearing a hospital gown under an army jacket buttoned crooked, his face pale but his eyes focused with the intensity of a soldier who'd survived something and was determined to do it again. Behind him walked a man in navy dress blues, his chest heavy with medals, the seal trident glinting above his heart. The room went absolutely silent. Not the absence of sound but the presence of something so large that it consumed noise entirely. The SEAL commander's eyes found Laura across the room. He didn't move toward her. He just looked. And in that look was recognition. It was the kind of recognition that didn't need explanation. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Her son's face went white. Silver star for Valor under fire. Nurses began pulling out phones. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Sterling's confident posture fractured like glass under pressure. Purple Heart. The scarred patient wept openly now, his voice broken. Senior Chief. Thank God. Thank God. The ICU doors hissed open at 11:56 p.m., and everything Laura had built in silence came apart in a single moment of Arabic rage. A patient with a scarred face, burn marks mapping his left cheekbone like topographic lines, was thrashing in bed his restraints creaking under the force of his panic. Security was already moving toward him, hands raised, voices calm and professional, but the man's eyes locked onto Laura the instant she stepped through the threshold. He screamed. Not words at first, just sound, primal, terrified, a noise that came from a place deeper than language. Then the Arabic came, sharp and urgent, his hand stabbing the air in her direction while monitors shrieked their electronic panic beside him. His voice cracked on a single word repeated over and over, Senior Chief. Senior Chief. Senior Chief. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Security moved to restrain him, but Marcus, who had followed his mother back into the hospital despite her protests, stepped forward instead. His hand found Laura's elbow. His commanding officer's instinct recognized the body language of combat trauma, of a man seeing a ghost he'd already mourned. Mom, Marcus whispered, his voice careful, the way he spoke to injured soldiers in the field. He keeps saying a senior chief. What does that mean? Laura's hands trembled. Not from fear. From recognition. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint, the kind that comes from holding back a decade of silence all at once. She reached for the patient's chart. Her fingers found the intake summary. Asylum application. Ramadi refugee. Sought protection from the tribunal. And then the words that made the world tilt, former insurgent. Female American operative pulled him from burning structure during Fallujah incursion. Same operative orchestrated cell capture. Survived. Seeking her. He wasn't screaming at her. He was calling for her. The security team maintained their perimeter, but the patient had stopped fighting. He was staring at Laura with the expression of a man who'd just seen someone return from the dead. His scarred face crumpled. Tears. Not rage anymore, release. Recognition. The weight of debts and ghosts and a woman who'd pulled him from fire 8 years ago in a city that no longer existed on any map he could find. Before anyone could speak, the ICU doors burst open again. Master Sergeant David Chen entered with a Navy SEAL team leader whose presence moved the air like a pressure system. The SEAL's uniform bore the insignia of 160th SAW, the Night Stalkers, and his eyes held the weight of classified briefings and conversations that happened in rooms without windows. He crossed directly to Laura. Not to the patient. To her. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Not a question. A statement of fact. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, mechanical, powerful, impossible to misunderstand. Silver Star. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Purple Heart. We've been looking for you. The room went so quiet the ventilators seemed to speak in a foreign language. Marcus's grip on her arm tightened. His commanding officer was here. In dress uniform. Alongside a SEAL operator whose tactical gear bore the weight of operations Laura had spent 8 years trying to forget. The patient in bed watched the recognition move across the SEAL's face, not surprise, but confirmation. A puzzle finally complete. An FBI liaison stepped from behind the SEAL commander, a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a leather folder. She opened it with the sound of official machinery turning over. Senior Chief, your testimony is required for a war crimes tribunal. The Ramadi operations, the cell you dismantled, the detainees you secured, all of it leads back to 3 individuals now facing international criminal court proceedings. Your evidence is critical. Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the far end of the ICU corridor, his face the color of bleached bone. He'd followed the commotion, drawn by the security alerts and the unusual traffic of uniformed personnel in his hospital. Now he watched the SEAL commander's words echo through the unit like shrapnel. "This woman is a decorated hero." The words hung in the air. They didn't bounce off the walls. They settled into them, into the fluorescent lights, into the monitors and ventilators and the very architecture of the hospital Sterling had ruled like a feudal domain. Laura Bennett wasn't a timid night shift nurse with employment gaps she couldn't explain. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer. Silver Star. The woman who'd pulled a man from burning concrete in a firefight. The operative who'd taken an entire insurgent cell into custody while her teammates provided covering fire and her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. The strategic competence he'd wielded so effectively, the board calls, the investigator contacts, the careful orchestration of her destruction, crumbled in the face of something he'd never anticipated. Decorations. Actual federal decorations. From the Department of Defense. From JSOC Command. Before Sterling could speak, before he could find some institutional angle to exploit, security appeared behind him. Not the ICU nurses. Not hospital personnel. 2 men in dark suits whose bearing marked them as federal, whose authority superseded everything Sterling had built in this facility. They carried a cardboard box identical to the one that had held Laura's possessions. The same box. The irony was almost graceful. Dr. Raymond Sterling. The voice was flat, professional, carrying the weight of termination paperwork already signed. It was the same security guard who'd walked Laura out 3 days earlier, who'd done Sterling's bidding without question or hesitation. Now his eyes held something different. Recognition, perhaps. Shame. The understanding of a man who'd been complicit in something uglier than he'd realized. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling's hand shook as he reached for the box. His medical journals. His framed credentials. His awards. The infrastructure of authority that had crumbled the moment someone asked who Laura Bennett actually was. He walked through the same corridors where he'd mocked her, where he'd thrown her charts at her feet, where he'd watched her accept humiliation with the composure of a woman who'd survived things he couldn't imagine. The nurses didn't look at him. One by one, they turned their backs. The gesture was simple, devastating, and completely effective. By Thursday afternoon, Dr. Sterling's BMW was blocked by news vans. His medical license review hearing was scheduled for the following month. The board members who'd answered his phone calls had already begun sending formal letters of distance, their careers suddenly more important than loyalty to a colleague they barely knew. By Friday morning, his name was being redacted from hospital records. By Monday, the institution had erased him the way institutions always did with men who'd become toxic. Laura stood in the ICU 6 months later, but not as a patient or a visitor or a nurse hiding behind a name that wasn't fully hers. She stood in her office, a new one, with a window overlooking the city, and checked her patients for the day. Her hands had stopped trembling. Physical therapy had helped. But mostly, the trembling had stopped because she'd finally stopped hiding. The boots were no longer locked away in a bedroom closet. They rested in a glass display case in the Hall of Honor, beside a photograph of Laura in dress uniform, her silver star visible against her chest, her eyes holding the weight of decisions made at 2 a.m. in desert compounds that no longer existed. She was walking to physical therapy, a habit now, treating the small injuries that combat had left behind, when she saw the folding table outside the strip mall. Auto insurance, best rates read the handwritten sign in marker that had begun to fade. Dr. Raymond Sterling sat behind it under a faded umbrella, talking to a customer who looked bored and mildly irritated by the entire transaction. His suit was wrinkled. His watch had been replaced with something cheaper, something plastic. His eyes met Laura's for exactly 1 second. She didn't stop. Didn't slow. Didn't acknowledge the ghost of the man who tried to destroy her. She just kept walking, the same way she'd kept walking through fire, through combat, through 8 years of silence that had finally become unnecessary. Some people never understood what they destroyed. Some never comprehended what they tried to break. Dr. Sterling would spend the rest of his life selling insurance policies from folding tables, remembering the day a decorated war hero had simply kept walking past him without breaking stride. Master Sergeant Chen returned to Mercy General monthly for follow-up appointments, and he always stopped by Laura's office. He never needed to speak. His presence said everything. She'd saved his life twice now, once in a burning building in Ramadi with bullets coming from 3 directions, once at a bus stop in Houston with nothing but quick hands and a pen casing. The asylum patient from the ICU recovered fully and testified at the International Criminal Court Tribunal, his words corroborating Laura's evidence in ways that helped convict 3 war criminals. Her voice, the one she'd kept silent for so long, had helped close the book on operations that would otherwise have claimed more lives in the shadows. Laura Bennett trained new nurses now, teaching emergency field medicine, teaching the kind of triage that happens when hospitals are too far away and time moves in units of seconds. She didn't hide her employment gaps anymore. She wrote them into lesson plans, used them as teaching moments, explained the reality of combat trauma and the necessity of healing through silence until silence became unnecessary. On the wall above her desk, a framed quote caught the light from her window: "Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark." She'd written it herself, the morning after Sterling's career ended, as a reminder that not all victories were loud, and not all heroes wore decorations until the world finally demanded to see them. The combat boots watched from their case, their laces still grimy with desert sand that would never fully wash out. Laura Bennett had walked through fire in those boots. She'd worn them on operations that would never be declassified. She'd packed them away because some things needed to rest before they could be honored. Now they rested in glass, finally at home, finally acknowledged, finally free. And so was she. Like this video if you believe in honoring those who served. If you have military in your family, past or present, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe and let's keep going.